What is a story? According to the computational linguist Jerry Hobbs, a story presents a purported causal structure of a complex of events. In other words, a story draws connections between events and puts them in an order. Now, Hobbs uses the word purported, implying that the connections between a story's events are not necessarily true. For instance, suppose I told the story, "It rained, I got wet." You more or less understand how these things connect. I probably walked through the rain. But what if I took a shower during the rain and never left my house? The two statements, "it is raining" and "I got wet," can both be true without one having caused the other. Storytelling is a selection process. By leaving out the shower and including the rain in my narrative, I paint a very different picture than if I'd done the reverse. The world is like a giant pool table, filled with infinite billiard balls bouncing off each other.
It's not always easy to find a causal structure or even an order between life's events, especially as they get more complex than showers and rainstorms. Relationships, politics, and emotions don't necessarily have singular causes.
The power of storytelling is to take the chaos of life and selectively cut it down into a clear and navigable pathway. Hobbes defines storytelling as an author's invitation to the readers to a mutual imagining. It doesn't matter how I really got wet. By telling a story, I'm inviting you to draw a specific connection between the rain and my wetness. I invite you now to join me in imagining my view of stories, how we understand them, how they're built, and how they shape our world. We'll travel through language, cognitive science, and ultimately culture, as I present a purported causal structure of a complex of ideas, if you'll imagine them with me. Building on Hobbes' work, the philosopher Nicholas Asher proposed segmented discourse representation theory to provide a formal way of graphing stories and to visually demonstrate how we interpret them. SDRT breaks every narrative into small nodes, called discourse units, or DUs.
Here's a short story. Michael bumped a glass of water. It fell over. This story has two discourse units, Michael bumping the glass and the glass falling. In the same way, my original rain story has two units, raining and getting wet. But a story is more than an ordered list of discourse units. In order to understand the story, "It rained, I got wet," you must draw a connection between its pieces, making the story cohere. Discourse coherence is the idea that we form stories from informational links that fill in the gaps between discourse units that are not inherently related. A narrative is coherent when you can easily find connections between its discourse units, as with Michael bumping the glass.
In contrast, here's an incoherent story. John took the train from Paris to Istanbul. He likes spinach. I'm not quite sure what those sentences have to do with each other. Is the spinach better in Istanbul than in Paris? Does the train itself serve great spinach?
It's much harder to find a connection here than in the glass or rain stories. But what are these informational links, these connectors between DUs that make stories cohere? In 1748, the philosopher David Hume proposed that people can only form connections between ideas based on one of three principles of association: cause and effect, resemblance, and contiguity in time or place. Applying these principles to narratives, linguists have broken them down into more specific varieties, called coherence relations, to show the exact mechanics of how two discourse units can connect. Let's start by looking at cause and effect. Result relations occur when one discourse unit causes the next, as in the story, Michael bumped the glass of water, it fell over. The second discourse unit was a result of the first. Ignoring my exclusion of the shower, my rain story is also a result relation. It was raining, so I got wet. Another cause and effect relation, explanation, is the inverse of result. For example, Taylor fell. He slipped on a banana peel. The second discourse unit explains the first. Result relations show what happens next in a story, while explanation relations show why the current event happened.
Amazingly, we can build these connections in our minds without any more information than the order in which a story is told. I was wet, it was raining, sounds like an explanation to me. Many coherence relations take the place of a conjunction, like so, which often indicates result relations, or because, which can indicate explanation. You can use these conjunctions explicitly, like I was wet because it was raining, but you never have to.
As the linguists Yayanskaya and Karakziova put it, coherence relations reflect cognitive principles that we apply when we try to make sense of the real world. We can build a story out of Michael bumping the glass because we know that glasses fall when jostled. We may have been able to understand the spinach train story if we had more information about how spinach, Paris, and Istanbul related in the real world. Back to specific coherence relations, let's move on to the Humean principle of resemblance. One common example is a parallel relation, where two DUs share something in common, often shown by the words to and also. For example, Barack Obama was president. George Washington was too. And again, our minds can form the connection without it being nearly that explicit. Jacob lives in a house. Liz lives in an apartment. Even though they live in different home styles, the format someone lives somewhere repeats in both sentences. Elaboration relations occur when one DU essentially says the same thing as the one before it, but in different words, providing more detailed information. For example, Walt had a healthy meal. He ate salmon. Eating salmon is another way of saying having a meal, but with more specifics. Colons and semicolons are a good sign of elaborations. And then there's contiguity relations, which are probably the first thing you think of when you hear story. The only variety are narration relations, where one DU immediately follows the previous chronologically, as in, Emery did their homework, then they went to sleep. Doing their homework didn't cause them to sleep, but it does set the stage for them to be ready for sleep. As soon as the first DU ends, the second one begins. Then and now are signals of narration relations.
Of course, most narratives are not as simple as the ones we've looked at so far. So let's look at a slightly longer story and see how all of its DUs connect.
Walt had a great evening last night. He had a healthy meal. He ate salmon. He devoured lots of asparagus. He then won a dancing competition. Walt had lots of fun. Walt's meal elaborates on his night. The salmon elaborates on the meal. Devouring asparagus is parallel to eating salmon. The dancing competition comes after the asparagus. But wait. We understand that the asparagus is parallel to the salmon, but it also elaborates on the meal. And the dancing competition doesn't necessarily come after the asparagus specifically, but the meal as a whole. We have no reason to believe that Walt finished his salmon first. And how does having fun connect? Doesn't it seem more like an elaboration on Walt having a great evening than just winning the dance-off? The meal was part of the fun. The truth is, this isn't a story made up of a bunch of linearly connected discourse units, but different groupings of discourse units connecting to each other. These groups of multiple DUs can each be considered their own complex discourse unit. The whole complex discourse unit of the meal connects to the dance. The whole CDU of the night connects to having fun. But how do our minds know when to connect to a single discourse unit as opposed to a group? You understand stories already, with or without SDRT. So, does some part of your subconscious secretly divide up stories into discourse units and coherence relations? If so, what do we consciously experience? What does it feel like to understand a story?
A theory of discourse coherence doesn't have an answer to this question, but fortunately, cognitive science may. The theory of simulation semantics says that we understand a story by picturing it in our minds. The experimental evidence for this is incredibly cool and has a lot to do with the idea of mirror neurons. But for the sake of time, I'll stick to discussing how simulation semantics functions.
When we begin reading or listening to a story, we clear out a picture space in our minds, a sort of imaginary stage that the narrative takes place on. We put a story's first discourse unit onto this stage, or, as it's sometimes called by linguists, into our attentional focus. We can then do only one of two things to this scene: add information to it, or change it. For example, let's say a story begins, "There was a tree." We could update this current simulation with more detailed information, the grass around it was dying, an owl lived in its branches, or we could simulate something new. The tree fell over. Notice that when we add to our simulation, the main image stays the same. When we simulate something new, however, we first have to erase our original picture. The same is true if we changed the simulation altogether. There was a tree. Elsewhere, there was a house. Notice the difference between that story and this one. There was a tree, a house stood in its shade. In SDRT, these two ways of affecting the picture space are known as coordination, which replaces our current simulation, and subordination, which makes a simulation more detailed without changing it. Each coherence relation falls into one of these two categories, no matter which principle of association it falls under. Elaboration relations are subordinating, because they add detail to a scene without changing it, like in, "There was a tree, an owl lived in its branches." We do not need to erase or replace anything in our simulation in order to add the new information to it. Result relations, on the other hand, are coordinating, because they change the scene in our picture space. Think about the story of Michael and the glass. In order to add a spilt glass to the scene, we first have to erase the standing glass. We always hold the present moment of a story in our picture space. Whenever we move forward chronologically in a story, like going from a full glass to a spilt glass, we coordinate away from our old view of the present and move to now. In subordination, however, we pause our timeline and either learn more physically about the image we're picturing, as with elaboration, or learn more temporally about the present. We rewind to see how we got here. This is the case in explanation relations, which are also subordinating. When we hear, "Taylor fell, he slipped on a banana peel," we're not actually changing our simulation from a fallen Taylor to the cause of his fall, but updating our image of his fall with the detail of the banana peel. If you look up the word coordinate in a dictionary, it roughly means next to, while the word subordinate means inside. In other words, two DUs connected by a coordinating relation exist as separate equal-level entities, next to each other in time. A DU connected to another with a subordinate relation, however, exists inside of the other, known as its parent. The glass falling, while causally related to Michael bumping, is an entirely separate event. The slip on the banana peel, however, exists within Taylor's fall. DUs connected with subordinating relations are actually just one complex discourse unit. CDU refers to a parent DU and all of its subordinate pieces. Narration relations of course coordinate, moving forward in time and subsequently changing the image in the picture space. Emery did their homework. Then, we changed scenes to, Emery went to sleep. Parallel relations are also coordinating, but they're slightly different than the others. All of the other coherence relations tell you something about time. Result in narration move forward, elaboration stays present, and explanation moves backwards. But what about in the story Barack Obama was president, so was George Washington? If parallel relations can move backward in time, as with the president example, can they still be coordinating?
Something weird is happening here, but we can't get to it yet. For now, we'll have to keep this question at the back of our minds as we finally move on to the visual representation part of SDRT.
In segmented discourse representation theory, discourse units are nodes on a graph, and coherence relations are the lines that connect them. Coordinating relations connect horizontally, while subordinating relations connect below the current DU. Even though a subordinate DU and its parent DU might look the same size, it's important to remember that under on the graph actually means inside. Let's take a closer look at the meal from the story of Walt's Great Evening, which, as we've learned, is actually just one complex discourse unit. The second two DUs have subordinating relations from the first via elaboration, but they also coordinate from each other with a parallel relation. If you removed the first DU, this would be a story of two equal size events. The first DU becomes the playing field for a smaller story contained within the story. The next sentence in the story of Walt's Evening, winning the dancing competition, is not part of the mini-story contained within the meal, but coordinates away from it. Really, there are two separate stories here. One of them talks about a whole night, one of them just a meal. We could tell either story without the other, but together they become more complex.
The last idea of SDRT that we'll explore in this video is called the right frontier constraint. It says that we can only connect new DUs to whichever DU is currently at the center of our attention, or whichever image is currently in the picture space.
We can figure out which DU is in focus by looking at the graph of a story. The furthest right node on the highest rung of the graph will be in the audience's picture space, as will its furthest right subordinate DU. We can only connect new DUs to the furthest right node on the highest level of the graph, or the furthest right node on any of that DU's subordinate levels.
The story of Walt's Great Evening was actually invented to demonstrate the power of the right frontier constraint. Now that we know about coordination and subordination, let's look at that story again, along with some pieces of it that I previously left out, to see how the right frontier works.
Walt had a great evening last night. He had a healthy meal. He ate salmon. The meal is subordinate to the evening, and the salmon is subordinate to the meal. So all three are on the right frontier, and we can connect to any of them. Once we coordinate, however, the leftmost du on that level of the graph will leave the right frontier and our minds. When I say, he devoured lots of asparagus, the salmon leaves the right frontier, but everything else stays on it. He then won a dancing competition. Now the meal and the entire lowest rung of the graph has left our minds. The story continues. Then he had a great dessert. Something's a little weird here. We'd assume that the dessert would either come after the meal or be a part of its description. But since we only have the dance and the night as a whole currently in our focus and memory, we connect the dessert to the dance with a narration relation. Nothing is technically wrong with this. If the narrator wanted us to connect this to the meal, we as an audience understand that they would have said it at a different time because, as I've said before, the way we make sense of a story has everything to do with the order in which we hear its events. Now the story goes, it was a beautiful pink. But what is a beautiful pink? Was the dessert pink? If so, why would the author tell us that without telling us what type of dessert? This goes against our knowledge of how food is usually described. Was the night itself pink? What would that even mean? Because nothing on the right frontier can connect to the pink du, this story is incoherent. The only thing it would make sense to describe as a beautiful pink would be the salmon, but it left the right frontier in our minds a few sentences ago. The story ends, Walt had lots of fun. Despite the incoherent hiccup, we can connect this du easily to the opening sentence because it has never left the right frontier of the graph.
Next time a story doesn't make sense to you, think about what was on the right frontier. Maybe there were too many things a pronoun like it or then could have referred to, or maybe there were none at all. Whether or not we are consciously aware of it, the right frontier and what is in our picture space dictates what we do and don't understand. A story that makes sense will always follow the rules of the right frontier constraint and discourse coherence that I've described so far. There is one small exception to the right frontier constraint known as recall. Recall uses definite language to effectively copy and paste an old du and attach it to the right frontier via a special recall relation.
In the salmon example, we could have said the salmon from the meal was a beautiful pink, because it brings the meal and the salmon back into our minds before connecting to them. You may have noticed that I use recall a lot in this video, in an attempt to make sure you know what I'm talking about at all times. There's a big difference between saying that story after there's been a long interlude between examples, and the story of Michael bumping the glass. The definite title makes you recall something from earlier, while the indefinite one makes you assume you're attaching to the last thing we were talking about.
Based on segmented discourse representation theory, we now more or less have an answer to the question of why we understand stories. As we move forward in this story of stories, you'll hopefully see how fundamental these building blocks are to our comprehension of everything from novels to TV shows to day-to-day conversations. But before we add new theories to what we've learned so far, let's pump the brakes and poke a hole in this one. Here's one final story to analyze.
Marion washed the dishes. They washed the forks. They washed the spoons. They vacuumed the living room. They organized the books. Cleaning the house exhausted them. That story definitely makes sense. Washing the forks is an elaboration on the dishes. So is washing the spoons, which is parallel to forks. Vacuuming the living room coordinates away from the dishes with a parallel relation, with the similar form, Marion cleaned something, as does organizing the books. But when we mention cleaning the house, we hit a problem. The only thing on the right frontier is organizing the books. But the last du clearly connects to the entire story so far, the dishes and the vacuuming and organizing the books. This is not an example of recall. Even though mentioning cleaning the house reminds us of everything we've said so far, if we copied and pasted all three discourse units back to the front of the graph, we'd be in the same position, only able to attach to organizing the books. Another possibility is the subordinating relation called generalization, which adds more complex information to a DU based on a logical jump from smaller information, as in, I like dogs, so I'm an animal lover. This might explain the story Marion organized the books, cleaning the house exhausted them. But in order to reference all of the coordinating DUs so far, which cleaning the house clearly does, we can't just subordinate from one DU. Something else is going on here.
Searching for an answer will take us beyond the basic theory of discourse coherence that we've learned so far.
In the next video, we'll explore a possible solution to this problem, and in doing so reveal some highly complex possibilities of storytelling.
Thanks for watching. See you next time.